So thank you, and over to you, Elaine, and we'll be back for questions in half an hour or so. Thanks.
Thank you. Right, well, I'm just going to, the first thing I'm going to do is share my slides with you so that we can all see what we're doing. And what I'm going to be talking about today, as you know, is practical tips for assessing young learners in the classroom. And I think as teachers, this is something that worries us all, that we are being sure to be fair to our learners, but at the same time, we can honestly monitor their progress. So I think we've all got that in common. And obviously what's nice at the moment in this rather difficult situations we all find ourselves in is that we can connect as teachers. As you can probably see, I'm talking to you from a very dark and gloomy London, so I hope you're all having a better, lighter and sunnier time. So let's get started on this. As the title suggests, we're going to actually give you some practical ideas, or share some practical ideas what you can do in the classroom with young learners. But there's a couple of things we need to think about, I think, just to make sure that we all sort of understand the same situation and the same context, and we can think about, if you like, what are the challenges and issues that we face before we start setting up this assessment. So I just want to go through some of those before we start looking at actual examples. And I'm sure these are all things that you are going to be familiar with, but sometimes it's helpful to pull it all together. And the first thing to look at is what are the challenges in assessing young learners as opposed to later teens or adults. And of course, one thing we know about the young learners in our class is that they have socio-cognitive and emotional differences. Now, what does this mean for testing? We know those differences are there. What the sort of outcome of that for testing, if you like, is it means that probably a lot of them have got a very short attention span. And they're also, as we know, they're not necessarily learning in a linear way. They go backwards and forwards and up and down. And those elements mean that I think we have to start thinking more about holistic judgments rather than wrong and right, because if we capture something on one day, it's not necessarily true the next day for our young learners. And the other thing to think about with them, obviously it depends on the age group that you're actually teaching, because young learners is quite a big bracket of them, from 5 up till about 12, depending when they switch school, is their relationship with their first language. And there's still learning many aspects of their first language, and more importantly, they're learning how to express their identity in their first language, and they are going to associate language with identity. So what does that mean for assessment? Well, I think it means that any assessments we do, any tasks or little activities we give them, must really connect to their world. They mustn't be disassociated things that, you know, you sometimes find, especially online. So we want to really try and develop little tasks that connect to their world and allow them to express their worlds in their terms, if you like. They also, these young learners, they're going to have a very varied relationship with education and learning. And I think particularly at the younger end, as they come in and they're starting to get used to what the education system is and what it means and what learning is, they're not necessarily going to understand the significance of assessment. It's probably going to give them a lot of anxiety. They're not really sure what it means, what the outcome is. So we must make sure that they're always very involved in the assessment that we give them. We're not just imposing it on top of them, that we're including them, however young. And the most important thing is, of course, very difficult with young learners, is we must protect their self-esteem. And as we know, assessment can be, for all of us, it can be very damaging. We all hate it when we fail a test. I mean, I failed my driving test first time and I felt terrible, even though I was an adult. With young learners, even if it's a tiny vocabulary test, if they get it wrong, they feel awful. So we've got to be looking at assessments that protect the young learners and give them every chance of success. So we're making sure that they can be successful rather than looking at what they don't know. So let's just move on a little bit and think, just before, as I say, we look at some examples. What kind of things can we assess in our young learners? Now, again, some of you will have thought of this yourselves, or you'd be familiar with it, or you will naturally understand this. But I think we've really got to try and move away from what I call accuracy. You know, is the grammar wrong or right? Is the vocabulary wrong or right? Moving away from this idea of accuracy, which they get plenty of time to practice in the classroom, and taking a slightly more holistic approach, because remember what we said, we want them to be successful. We want to motivate them and promote their self-esteem. So the other sort of things we can assess just quickly, and this is developed more in the paper that we're going to send you the link to, is we could assess the sub-skills. So things like turn taking in speaking. So rather than was what you said absolutely perfectly accurate, are you good at taking turns when you're speaking? Something a bit, you know, that they'll be familiar with from their first language. We could assess their behavior. Are they being calm? Are they paying attention? Because this is all part of learning, and we want to promote, through the assessment, we want to promote their learning, this idea of assessment for learning to help them. We could assess their attitude. Are they good at collaborating? Are they enthusiastic when they do something? So we can reward this, and maybe the students that aren't notice that the others get rewarded and they learn what is expected of them. We could assess their willingness, perhaps slightly older younger learners, their willingness to improve. How good are they at making things better? And I'll come into that a bit more when we look at the examples. Again, we might want to reward them for their speed of completing a task or their effort, their number of efforts. So these are just alternative aspects, criteria that we can assess that mean we're not always focused on is it wrong or is it right, but more about how good is it, how far along the scale. So let's look now at some actual practical examples, and I'm going to look at 4 different types of assessment we can do in the classroom. We can do something called conferencing, which is asking deep questions. We can do observation, which most of you will be familiar with. We can assess holistic and task-based activities, and we can assess projects and portfolios. So these are all ways moving, really those 4, moving from the micro to the macro ways of assessing young learners with the criteria, with some of the criteria that I've just been talking about. And I will return to that at the end so that you've got a good list of that. So let's start with the first example there, conferencing. Now, conferencing is really, it's very deep questioning. So it's not the normal yes, yes, no questions. Here, we're trying to understand the quality of their learning. How well do they understand something? And in asking them questions which explore how well they understand something, we help the learners to build their own metacognitive skills. And by metacognitive skills, we mean their understanding of how to learn. It doesn't happen overnight, but if you do it over a year or through the years while they're young, they slowly begin to understand how they're learning, and they can start to use that to help themselves. And the kind of deep questioning we do, even with little learners, can be what we call critical thinking questions, or asking them to repeat things. The young learner can be involved in this because there's no right or wrong answers. So anything they say is, if you like, valid or valuable. Now, their answer might not be the thing you are assessing, but it is your window into their progress and your way to see how far they understand something. And also, because they're giving answers like this, they can be themselves, which is what we said we wanted. Let's look at a little example of this. So I've taken a very low level example here. This is level 2. This is from a Cambridge publication called Kids Box, something you're familiar with, where they're doing a word search activity because you've already taught the vocabulary, and here presumably you're doing something where they try to remember the vocabulary. Now you might think, oh yes, well they can find those letters, but I don't really know how well they know this. So this is where you want to start asking them deep questions. And you may want to do this even in their first language, because what you're getting at is how good their understanding is. So you know, have they made progress, or do you need to repeat something? So for example, we've got the word desk there. You might say to them, well, what do you do on your desk? You know, do you sit on your desk? Do you write on your desk? Do you eat on your desk? What do you do on your desk? Or you might ask them, what do you have on your desk? What kind of things can we find on your desk? And this could be their desk at home, or if they've got desks at school, maybe. And where can you see a desk? What places do you find? Is a desk in the kitchen? Or sometimes it is, maybe, especially nowadays, but that's fine. So this is what I mean about there's no wrong or right answer, but you're exploring ideas with them to see how far they understand something. So you would do this after you'd actually taught the vocabulary. You're then getting them to think about it more, and it's more interesting for them because they can relate it to, again, what they know in their first language. So that's just a very simple idea of how you might do conferencing with very low level. Obviously, as they get better in higher levels, it becomes easier to do the more in-depth, critical, quick thinking questions of why and how. So the next thing we said we'd look at is observation, which I'm sure, you know, all teachers automatically do every day. When you're doing observation, you're basically collecting data on your students, and you can understand the extent of their learning, how far they've gone in understanding the outer edges of what you're doing. You can identify those earlier features we were talking about, which may be affecting their learning. For example, their attitude, their enthusiasm, their collaboration. So if you ask them to do something, even something very simple, like open your books at page 3 and read a little text, you can observe how they're moving into that and how much attention they pay and how quickly they do it. And this may give you, in terms of assessment and progress, this will give you an idea of maybe what you need to focus on or what's causing them not to absorb something. I think the important thing here is that you should design a set of observation criteria. So you're not just randomly looking at them on, you know, what you think the day, but you think, no, I'm going to look at how quick they sit down and read, or how quickly they get through that text. For example, that's just an example. And it also means that you're judging them all the same, which is very, very important for fairness and something young learners are terribly aware of. Now, how is the young learner involved? Well, of course, what you can do is ask them to agree on what those criteria might be. And then this has 2 advantages. One, it involves them so they feel part of it rather than a judgment being passed on them. But also it supports their own learning because they think, oh, well, you know, if I do have to sit down and read this quickly, if that's the thing, they begin to understand the meta features that they have to bring to their learning. So observation can be, you can do it for all sorts of tasks, but I think the important thing is to have a limited set of criteria that you use at different times, and that those are applied to all students. So let's have a look at what some of those judgment criteria might be quickly. So they might be, obviously you've got a list there, you can all read. How quickly do they engage? How well do they reason? Do they keep trying? How well are they participating? The reason I've given you this list is to illustrate that it doesn't have to be about wrong or right, or whether they've finished something or not finished something. This is very much how the students are approaching something that might be affecting their progress that you need to assess and know about. So those are just examples. You will have your own ideas of the kind of criteria, but again, with very young learners, I would only use 2 or 3 at the same time. I've just given you a list there, so you can pick and choose, but I would limit the criteria that you're using. So, and we said the third thing that we were going to look at was holistic and task-based activities. Now, I mean, nowadays, a lot of course books have a lot of task-based activities in, and you will want them to do that task as part of normal classroom, practicing, just practicing the work you've been doing, not assessing. But you can also sometimes pull things out and use them a bit later on for assessment. We'll look at a couple of examples. This is a good way for you to identify and reward individual success. And by that I mean, and this ties in with this second thing of it allowing for difference. So what I mean here is when they've done a task-based activity, you might find that one student has done something very carefully and that can be rewarded. One student has done something very fully and that can be rewarded. One has done it very quickly. So remember we said our young learners are all very, very different, but it allows you to reward something to give them some success. So even if they've made a bit of a mess of a lot of it, you will probably be able to find something that you can reward and encourage them with. Because it's this sort of broader task that you're doing. Now, I think the important thing here is what tends to teaching is we set a task-based activity and we tend to focus on completion. Have you done it yet? Have you finished? You finished? Has everybody finished? Have we finished yet? What I would urge you to do is to focus on the process rather than the completion. So much more, how are they doing this? How carefully are they doing it? How well are they doing it? Are they being superficial? Are they going in depth, depending on what the task is? And so that eventually you get the students to start taking that process seriously rather than just, I finished, miss, regardless of the quality of the work. Of course, the advantage of task-based activities is often they allow students to do something for themselves, to investigate something themselves, or to use their own ideas. So this comes back to this idea that we allow them to be themselves. So I've just got a couple of little examples here for you, which are taken from Power Up. So one's from level 1. So that's right at the sort of 6-7-year-old, and going up to level 3, which is that bit older, that's probably about 9-ish, depending on, where you are. And you can see they've each got, so for example, the level 1 is about, it's got a series of prompts there to help them set up their sports day. So they can go ahead and do that task as you would normally do it in class. Now, how can you use that for assessment? Well, as I say, as they're doing it, you could possibly look at how they're doing it and reward that. But I don't think that's a very good, such a good idea as doing the assessment later, because remember here they're just doing the task. They're doing the task as part of class. You want to come back and do it as assessment. So maybe you come back a week later and you set them the same task in a different group, or the same task with tweaks, or you go into just one of those prompts, one of those parts of it, and you assess it and you see if, following having done it very thoroughly in class, they have then absorbed that. Are they just repeating what they did before? Have they added to things? Have they embellished it? Have they done a better version? And that's what you want to assess. And the same for the level 3 one, where they've got to plan a week in the life of the circus artist. Now, you would do that as your task-based activity in class, but presumably afterwards you would ask them to share ideas and you would discuss it and you would see what had happened. Now, if you go back to that a week later, how much of that have they absorbed? Do they include the rest of the class's ideas this time? Do they improve it? Do they make it better? And this repetition in itself, as we all know, is very important for learning with young learners. So that once they're done, it's a very nice idea if you can use a course book to repeat and develop things as part of your assessment, because it's very familiar material, of course. And other task-based activities, I mean, you want to think about, you might want them to do drawings, including diagrams to show their understanding. They might make a model. As here, they might be doing actions and role play. As they get older, you might want them to do some concept mapping as part of the task, or making some sort of table or list from the data or the information they've got. So I say you can reward their behavior, their attitude, their number of attempts. Very important is to agree, if you're going to do an assessment from this, agree what the good performance descriptors are. What do you expect? If we look at the level 3 one, where they're planning this weekly schedule, so they've done it once in class, a week later you come back to it and you want them to do it again, but better. Agree with them first. What are you going to judge it on? So I'm going to judge it on how detailed your schedule is, or I'm going to judge it on how much variety you've got in your schedule, or whatever is appropriate to your task. But always involve them. Don't just impose it on them. Try and, you know, get them to understand what a good performance is, and get them to take responsibility basically for what they're doing. I mean, you might ask them something simple a week later, like, let's say this weekly schedule in level 3. A week later, you might say to them, okay, go back and look at your schedule. Now, what would you change on that? Now, if they say nothing, you know maybe that they haven't really understood what they're doing there. But if they offer you suggestions of what they would change, that's your assessment window into how far they have progressed and moved things along. And then the last thing we wanted to look at was using projects and portfolios, which are much longer term. So I think we all know what a specific project is. It might be something that takes them a few days or a few weeks in class that you've got focused on a particular topic. And a portfolio, not everybody's familiar with this, so I'll just explain. A portfolio is where the students gather a collection of their work, not on the same topic, just a collection of their work across the term or across the year. And often you give them the opportunity to put their best version in, their improved version. Now here you can use these to assess how far they've applied their learning to the various projects and points that you've given them. Because built into this is this idea of you're going to do your best version or your improved version, it allows the learners to have this very strong mental model of success. This is what success looks like. So you're giving them that model of success. They know what to aim for, and that's very, very helpful for their learning. You can ask the learners, again, to be involved. do you want the product, how much do you want to put, as well as kind of standards that you expect. So I want your best writing, or, you know, I want your longest piece of work. So the young learner can be involved in the choice and the ownership. And I think what you want here is to create a situation where basically they're showing off. Maybe this is something they can show to other teachers or their parents. They're showing off, this is the best that I've done. And children love to be successful at things. So this is how we're helping them. But it allows you to assess and help their understanding as they go through. So let's just look, just as we sort of, I'm just drawing to an end of the presentation, then you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. And I just want to round up by having a little look about how we might manage this assessment process, you know, and draw out the threads we've been talking about. I think the first message is very much to involve the learners, however young they are. Share the purpose of your assessment, why you're doing it, or what is it for, and use them to collaborate on the judgment criteria. You know, how many words are we going to use, or how quickly are you going to do this, or shall I, you have lots and lots of different elements of criteria, and you can slowly teach your learners what those are and what is good and what you're focused on, but that they can agree with you so that everybody knows what's expected of them and they've agreed to that before they start. I think the other thing that's very important, because we've said how important it is that they are motivated and rewarded for success, it's the idea of bias for best, that you give them the best possible chance of doing well. And this involves preparation. And I would always, before I do an assessment with young learners, I would never just put it on them. I would always give them lots of opportunity for oral work and discussion and planning and collaboration, so that before they actually do it, they're almost ready. They know what they're doing before they do it. And I wouldn't worry, therefore, that, oh, well, that's not fair, that's not an assessment, because they know it, because it is. They've still got to produce it. And in planning it, they are learning all the time and absorbing while they're planning. So you're really doing an assessment for learning there. And make sure that you allow them enough time. There's a tendency, we're all so pressed for time and getting through the curriculum, there's a tendency for us to rush things. But I think make sure, especially with very young learners, that they have enough time, that they don't feel harassed into producing what they need to produce. Then you want to make sure every time you're assessing them in this more holistic way that you are formally recording their progress, so that you've made some standardized notes, or perhaps you've got a little scale for grading, but that you've got possibly each student's name down in a little list, and you're making notes about how they're progressing across the term. And this is actually a little bit of support for you as teachers as well, because it means if somebody comes to you and says, oh, why did my darling child not get a grade A? You can look back and you've got a little record of, you know, how the child has performed, or what you've got a record of what they're good at, which is much more objective and convincing for both the students and their parents. And you might also want to write down how the child responded to any feedback that you gave. And I think the last sort of foundation stone, as it were, is making sure we give meaningful feedback. And we can't give young learners, if we give young learners too much feedback, they can't absorb it. Even adults, it's too much information. So it's a good idea to try and be patient and spread your tasks out, and so that you can give them just a single feedback point, maybe a bit more as they get older, plus helping them with how to improve that point and giving them the time to do that improvement. So I would think those are the really important steps. So that is drawing to the end of the presentation, just to look at some ideas for assessment for young learners. And I think we might now be moving on to some questions.
Thank you so much, Elaine. That was really, really interesting. Been following the comments in the chat box, which have been incredibly positive, and happily, despite the occasional slight glitch, your London Wi-Fi has held up, which is great. And so I think people have caught almost all of it, and yeah, well worth the time. Just to kind of think about a few of the questions now. A number have come in, and one of the areas, understandably, is what does this mean online? So what are the best ways to do formative online assessments? I want to understand how to assess children during the online sessions, which we are all currently facing, and especially the ones who don't turn in the assignments or tasks. How can we apply all these steps online? So that's just a series of initial questions, and completely understandable under current global circumstances.
Yes. Yes, and I imagine most people are in that situation now. Of course, there's two strands to this, which, you know, as Oliver said, there's probably a long series of questions about this. We probably can't address them individually, but if I try and sort of take an approach about online generally, you probably fall into two categories. Some of you will be having synchronous classes with your students. In which case, some of what we've said here about deep questioning, and you know, you can even sometimes observe them. You can do that because if you're running a synchronous classroom, you can sort of see what's going on. I think the issue is when it's asynchronous and you're not at, which it actually must be very common for very many teachers at the moment, where you're setting them work and you're not really seeing them, and stuff is, you know, coming in, or they're watching a video of class and you're having to manage it asynchronously, which is very difficult. I would say a couple of general points here. I think number one, the most important, if you like, help I can suggest to you is do not worry about copying. We've got an expression in English where we say that ship has sailed, and that would mean that when your students are working offline and coming to you or coming to you online, you have no idea, of course, if that's something that we're very on top of in the classroom, if they've copied. Maybe they've asked their parents, maybe they've gone to Google, maybe they've all worked together on it. You don't know. And we can't do anything about that. So I think it's kind of pointless trying to control that. What we want to say about that is actually, if they do start copying, this is where you want to go into understanding how much they understand in depth about something. So if you're running a synchronous classroom, some of you saying they're not doing their work, same as you would in normal class, you start asking them all individual questions. And actually, if they haven't done the work, it becomes much more embarrassing and awkward for them, but they're still there and they've got to listen to the others. And as I said, this idea with young learners that repetition is part of learning. So even if they've copied and they have to repeat it to you, or even if they haven't done the work and they have to repeat what their next door neighbour says, because you're not going to ask one of them, you're going to ask lots of them and they're not going to know who. Just that repetition embeds the learning for them, and you can be more confident, because assessment is about you understanding their progress. You know, it's not just about the assessment per se. If they're working offline, I mean, I imagine some of them are going to be doing online tests, or you're going to be working with worksheets and things. And as I would say, I wouldn't worry about copying. I would start focusing when you assess those worksheets on how well they've done something. And some of you will have learner management systems where you'll be able to see how many times they've tried to do something, how many attempts, or how quickly they've done something. So you can still focus on these meta elements of assessment. And it's about you setting up for the students your expectations. So if you say, well, you know, I'm going to assess you on how much attention you're paying, then, you know, they know that, well, I'm not saying some children won't, but they will all know what the expectations are. Whereas if you say, I'm going to assess you on whether it's wrong or right, you've got no control over that because you don't know whether they're copying other people or looking it up on their phones. So you want to really make the most of that holistic style assessment where you can, and try and set a standard, I think, for the young learners about your expectations of their behaviour offline and online with you, which is to do with concentration and calmness and this sort of willingness to improve and engage if you're asking questions and make it better. I mean, it's not a perfect world, but you can, I suppose what I'm saying is you can still apply some of these principles online. You don't have to just go down the route of worksheets.
Okay, brilliant, and thank you. Very complete answer to that question. Those kind of that range of questions. There's also one from, this is from Mariela Marquez. Can you share some more in-depth assessment for nursery and reception and foundation stage in terms of assessing kind of really, really young learners, small kids?
So they're under 5, are they? They must be. Is she from Spain?
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know where she is from, unfortunately.
Okay.
Certainly from by the sound of it, a Spanish, you know, a Spanish-speaking country.
Okay, so probably be under 6 then, wouldn't it?
Very likely.
I mean, I think then what you're doing, do you remember we said at the beginning that the children are beginning to get used to education and what education is, and it's quite harsh on them to be assessed in some way. So we don't want to formalize it. We want to remember that the assessment is for you, the teacher, for you to understand progress rather than it being visited on the students. And I do think that those very young learners, we really, really don't want to be in a field where we're saying, oh, you know, 8 out of 10 vocabulary items. I think it's got to be about their attitude and their behaviour. Are they sitting down and listening? Are they concentrating? Do they put their hand up to answer? Are they enthusiastic? So you want to assess and reward the meta-learning behaviour that will help them when they get to proper school, I think. Because you don't, you know, for example, as we said about vocabulary, you can assess, you know, 5-year-olds, or you can give them a 10-word vocabulary test, and they may all get 10 out of 10, and 1 week later they don't know any of it because their progress isn't linear. So, you know, you've got to think about what kind of data. Remember, assessment is data. What kind of data can I collect that I can rely on that's helpful for the students, I think.
Okay, excellent, brilliant. We're running very short of time now, but here's another question, which again is related to the digital side of things. So what about assessment? This is Noor. What about assessment in a flipped classroom?
Well, I think this is part of what I said about involving the learners. I mean, I think if that's the case, you know, again, it depends on the age. I mean, I imagine there you're talking about the slightly older end of what we would call young learners, where they understand what school is about. They're beginning to understand what learning is about, you know, especially if you're doing a flipped classroom, they must understand something of that. And I think you can push it all over to them. You can even get them to design a test. Why not?
Yeah, Well, why not? Yes, indeed. And I think we've probably got time for one more question. There are loads, and it's a great shame that we can't reach them all. But thank you everyone for engaging so carefully and so closely to this talk. From Anaga Subarna, and I'm sorry if I've said that wrong. While giving feedback, should it be elaborate or short?
Short. Young learners, short. Remember we said they had a short attention span and it wavers. If you give them, for example, back a piece of writing where they've got grammar mistakes and vocabulary mistakes and they haven't organised this and they haven't done that, it just goes right over. It's just too much information. There's too much to correct. You want this very positive situation where you're saying, you know, you might want them, you know, for example, they might be doing a tiny little speaking task, but they're interrupting each other. So your feedback is, no, we've got to take turns. So I want you to, so then you're going to help them. You can say, I want you to wait 5 seconds before you speak. Let's count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just to get them. They won't remember it. They won't do it all the time, but it's one thing that they can focus on. And when they do it, you can say, great, and reward them for making that improvement so that they learn that improvement is a good thing and something that they want to do. If you give them too much information, it's overwhelming, it's damaging for their self-esteem. So you want to give them, I think as they get a little bit older, you can, you know, you can do 2 or 3 points maybe, but very limited and always with how to improve.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to try and slip one more thing in because it looks like we might have a moment. There's a number of questions. Sorry, Elaine. People are interested in what you've got to say, which is wonderful. There's a number of questions kind of related to the idea of kind of sensitive children, shy children, and how to get them involved in this kind of, well, this kind of assessment, this kind of engagement, whether it's online or offline. And obviously kind of not wanting to let their shyness, their affect what they actually, you know, genuinely know. So are there routes around that? Are there recommendations there?
I think that's where we would want to focus very much on the holistic, or, you know, the task-based, the project activities, those sort of larger, let's say, activities rather than assessment, that you can draw assessment strands out of, that you can individualize to the child. So if the shy child eventually learns, well, they're very, very good at writing neatly, you know, that makes them, that's their thing, that's their identity. I'm the neat writer in the class, you know, so it gives them, you know, much better self-esteem. So this is why, in a way, where we started off the talk, obviously we haven't had lots of time, but I was trying to get us all to think about what are the very many different aspects we can assess in young learners to make sure that where you've got those children that, you know, you're struggling as a teacher to understand what their progress is, you can start to bring them out of themselves by rewarding those little aspects that they can do, which might be their behavior.
Okay, well, that's wonderful. And it's great to, well, the entire thing, I can't keep my eyes off the chat box because messages keep coming in going, wonderful, thank you, great insights. So thank you everyone very much for attending. It's been wonderful to see the numbers who've been here, but also where you've come from. This is genuinely global. That's wonderful. And Elaine, thank you so much for all your insights. And as we've shared several times in the chat, Elaine has this new white paper, and read it at your leisure, because I think we're all learning something from it. And there we go.